Hello, everyone. First of all, I'm delighted to be here today presenting to you, and I wanted to thank Jerónimo Martins for the opportunity. We just heard this morning very inspiring talks about the value of forests, also the complex issues and challenges that forests face. And now we're talking about actions, and we just heard from Eurocommerce compulsory requirements for companies when it comes to forests and deforestation. And now I'll be building on that and talking about the role that voluntary action beyond regulatory compliance and collaborative initiatives plays in this journey towards a forest-positive future. So before kicking off, just very quickly introducing Proforest. We are a mission-driven organization, and our mission is to build responsible and resilient commodity sectors and supply chains, also working at production level to create thriving production landscapes that deliver positive outcomes for people, for nature, and for climate. And we do this by being trusted technical partners of companies, but also a diverse array of stakeholders in these key commodity sectors. We work on a diversity of commodities. We also have presence in Europe, but also in the key production regions in Latin America, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And how do we deliver on our mission? So we have 25 years of experience, and we work on 3 main areas of action. First, we work directly with companies like Jerónimo Martins, but also companies along the whole supply chain all the way up to production, to help them develop and implement their responsible sourcing commitments. Secondly, we also work on supply chain collaboration, and this is where we bring a lot of different actors together to collaborate towards addressing some of the systemic issues in these key commodity sectors. And finally, we also work directly with the key influencers of supply chains, and this is mainly regulators, policymakers, and financial institutions, to make sure that these key actors are also driving the change that we need towards responsible and resilient commodity sectors. So with Jerónimo Martins, we do work directly in 2 of these 3 areas. So we've been working the last year with Jerónimo Martins to help you get ready to comply with the EUDR regulations, and also to update the deforestation and conversion-free policies that Jerónimo Martins Group has. And on the other side of things, we also work with Jerónimo Martins on supply chain collaboration, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on in the presentation. We work together with Jerónimo Martins in sectoral initiatives that they're part of, and also in landscape initiatives like we just heard from IPAM. So with that, 3 points that I'm going to be emphasizing today. Firstly, what are voluntary actions and initiatives, and what is their role in this transition towards forest positive? Then second, we'll be looking at successful examples of initiatives that are driving progress. And finally, this concept of resilience and why it is important to take action beyond minimum compliance with regulations. So with that, let's go to the first box. What are voluntary action and initiatives? So we can think of voluntary action and initiatives in 2 big buckets. First, we have voluntary frameworks and sustainability standards. And here, for instance, you can have companies' policies for responsible sourcing, for sustainability, companies' deforestation-free strategies and policies, and it's basically these actions and commitments that companies are taking beyond regulatory compliance in their sustainability journey. And there are key frameworks like the Accountability Framework Initiative, where stakeholders have agreed on what are the expectations and what is best practice for big global companies in implementing sustainable sourcing commitments. Secondly, we also have certification schemes that Didier from the CGF will later be talking on, that is a tool for companies to source their commodities responsibly. And finally, we also have a growing number of frameworks, like the science-based targets, for instance, that are defining what is best practice for companies when it comes to setting targets for climate or targets for nature, or also financial disclosures. But today, in my presentation, I'll be mainly focusing on this second bucket, and those are voluntary actions through collaborative initiatives. And this is when different actors in these key commodity sectors come together to address the complex issues that forests are facing. So we have different examples. For instance, when peers in a specific place in the supply chain come together to collaborate on these pre-competitive issues and drive progress. We have the CGF Forest Positive Coalition that I'll be talking a bit more about, and Jerónimo Martins is part of. But there's also other groups, for instance, where traders come together, like they came together to develop the trader roadmap to 1.5 degrees, or the Soft Commodities Forum, where the soy traders collaborate. Then we also have some collaboration groups in some commodities, for instance, in palm oil or in sugar, where there's strong collaboration among actors across the whole supply chain, so bringing together downstream companies together with the upstreams, traders, and producers. And finally, we also have collaboration more on the ground in landscape initiatives. So what is the role of these voluntary actions, and also how do they relate to compliance with regulations? So let's go back to regulatory compliance, and we just heard a lot about the EUDR. So the EUDR, for instance, and regulations help define what are the minimum expectations for companies. For instance, in the case of EUDR, the minimum expectations when it comes to deforestation. In this case, for instance, is in a specific market, in any volumes that are coming into the European Union, and also focused on a specific risk, in this case, deforestation. You then have voluntary frameworks and sustainability standards that go a step beyond and defining best practice for leading companies and are addressing risks, not just in this case focused on deforestation, but also allow companies to source volumes that are covering a diversity of risks, also looking at human rights, sustainable agricultural practices, etc. And it's defining kind of this best practice in that wider scale, allowing also companies to implement this best practice across the volumes that they source. Then we again take a bit of a bigger scale when we talk about collaborative initiatives. And again, this is where different actors come together to ensure that issues are addressed at scale and that systemic issues that companies alone can't solve can be solved more holistically. So how do these actions relate to each other? Actually, companies that have been taking voluntary actions for a long time in their sustainability journey are in a much better place now to start complying with the regulation. There's a lot that has been done already, and there's many of these tools that serve to help companies and support companies in complying with this regulation. At the same time, it also ensures that risks are being addressed not just in a few suppliers, but also in the wider scale, making sure that there's availability of compliant supply in the future. And at the same time, taking the right mix of actions, both through regulatory compliance, but also these wider voluntary actions, ensures that companies are helping to drive the transition to forest-positive and resilient and responsible commodity sectors. So you're not just making sure that your own narrow supply chain is sustainable and what you're buying is fine, but also that the wider sector, through collaboration with others, is moving in that direction as well, which helps build resilience and also address these wider risks in a much more efficient way. So, in a nutshell, why should a company engage in collaborative actions? It does help companies future-proof sourcing areas, meaning also building resilience into their supply chains instead of just narrowing and focusing on individual supply chains. You're also helping together with other key actors, together with your suppliers, together with other peers, to address these issues at a wider scale. It does support companies in regulatory compliance, but also meeting their commitments beyond just minimum compliance. It does help address existing risks in a more efficient way by bringing all the relevant stakeholders to the table and also addressing reputational risks that would otherwise already be present in the landscape. And then finally, stakeholder expectations. So as a leading global company, important to contribute to these global sustainability goals and the expectations from the wider sector as we move towards forest positive. So with that, let's now look at 2 examples of successful collaborative initiatives that in the last years have really helped to drive this progress. So we can think of collaborative actions in 2 scales. First, landscape and jurisdictional initiatives, and we just heard from IPAM all this work on the ground, with actors on the ground. And we can also think of collaborative initiatives at wider scales, like bringing together actors in a commodity sector or in a specific country, global initiatives. So we're going to start with the second one, and with a great example of the CGF, Forest Positive Coalition of Action, where Jerónimo Martins is a member, together with other 21 companies. This is a coalition of retailers and manufacturers, so downstream companies coming together to define what is best practice in this transition towards a forest-positive future, and what's the role that downstream companies can play to support that transition. Proforest is a key technical partner from the coalition, and we also have here CGF represented, and Didier will speak after me about some of the work with other coalitions as well. You can see there on the screen, probably you recognize many of these companies, so it's these big players coming together in this work towards forest positive. So just to take a step back and explain what's the approach of the coalition, why has it been so successful, and how was this approach built? So the coalition was launched back in 2020, and that's when companies realized that they had made a lot of progress in their own supply chains towards deforestation-free, but they still had work to do. There was still a gap, and deforestation was still happening. Even if companies were progressing in this journey, deforestation kept growing in some of these commodities. So what is it that needs to be done, and how can companies best contribute to the change that's needed? And there was a lot of reflection by companies, but also together with stakeholders, to think through what are the key levers of change, and which of these levers is where companies can really drive progress. And through these conversations, the theory of change of the Forest Positive Coalition came to be. And it's basically saying that it's really important that companies keep working on their own supply chains and make sure that the supply they buy and the commodities they buy meet the sustainability standards. But at the same time, it's really important that companies work with their suppliers to engage them on deforestation-free, on forest-positive, but also to support them to implement sustainability commitments, not just on the volumes that are being bought, but across their business. And then secondly, forest-positive landscapes, so how downstream companies also have a role to play, engaging on the ground with stakeholders on the ground and contributing to addressing the root causes of deforestation and conversion. So, what progress has the coalition built in the last 5 years? There's a lot that we've done in the last 5 years, but just some highlights. For instance, the coalition developed commodity roadmaps that have defined what is best practice in the implementation of deforestation-free and forest-positive commitments for palm oil, for soy, for pulp, paper and packaging, and for beef. And these have become key references across sectors and have raised the floor of business as usual on what is expected from companies in these sectors. Secondly, there's been a lot of active engagement and collaboration with suppliers, both on defining what's the journey to forest positive, but also how can we actually collaborate even on the ground to create this change. And also, a big step that the coalition took is the publishing of a landscape strategy and really defining what's the role and what's the ambition of leading downstream companies when it comes to landscapes, and building a very successful portfolio of 22 initiatives that are working towards forest positive. We heard from IPAM earlier the example of one landscape initiative, but there's 22 others right now that are driving this change across the different sourcing regions for these 4 commodities. And finally, the coalition is not just focused on driving change for the 22 companies, but also how can the coalition drive change beyond these 22 companies and have a wider influence. And the coalition does that through engagement with key frameworks, stakeholders, but also increasingly with key actors that we want to bring on this journey, like the financial sector. What's next for the coalition? Building on these 5 years of success, the coalition will keep focus on building on all this progress and addressing remaining challenges, but also this point on bringing others on board. So how do we bring other peers, suppliers, financial sector together into this journey to keep collaborating to address the challenges ahead? Now, let's look more at the landscape and jurisdictional type of initiatives on the ground. So, why is it vital to collaborate in production landscapes? Essentially, when you're thinking of sustainable and resilient supply chains, you need to look back at production because that's where the risks are happening and that's where the risks need to be tackled and mitigated. So, whether that's addressing wildfires in Portugal, whether that's going back to the distant supply base in Brazil, it's really important that companies take that action on the ground. So what landscape initiatives do is essentially to bring together all the key stakeholders to align on a common vision for the landscape. So before, and still is the case many times, you used to see kind of siloed projects on the ground, a carbon project here, some work with suppliers here, but risks still being faced in the rest of the landscape. So through these initiatives, it's about building this common one single vision and working towards it together. Through the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of progress in these landscape initiatives. As I said earlier, a growing number in the portfolio of landscape initiatives, different actors coming together on the ground. There are some very successful pilots, like we heard earlier from Western Mato Grosso in Brazil. And now the next steps is how to build on this success. How do we scale up landscape initiatives? And particularly, how do we create more partnerships with suppliers, with traders, with financial institutions on the ground, building on existing partnerships like the one that, again, IPAM talked about with the soy traders and the companies in the CGF Forest Positive Coalition. How can we replicate this model to drive the action in landscapes at the scale that is needed? And with that, let's go to the first point that I want to cover today, and it's back to this topic of resilience, a word that I've used quite a lot through the presentation, and why taking action collaboratively is really important to drive this resilience. So first, what do we mean by resilience? In the kind of current context and the world that we live in with climate change, with geopolitical instability and uncertainties, resilience is becoming more and more important than ever. And we can think of resilience in two complementary ways. For a downstream company like Jerónimo Martins, resilience and a resilient supply chain might mean ensuring supply whatever happens. So any change that happens, any disruption, the supply keeps going. But this is really paired with resilience at production. And building resilience at production means how can producers also respond to these shocks and respond to these changes that are going to be faced more and more. So in this diagram, we can clearly see why taking an approach that also involves collaborative action and this wider scale of addressing risks in landscapes and in sectors is really key. If a company takes an approach to only focus on cleaning up their own supply chain, meaning you work to get traceability and to get supply that's segregated, you will be making progress cleaning your own supply chain, but you will be creating sort of islands of excellence, meaning that whereas your supply chain is clean, the risks are still happening in the production level, meaning your supply chain also becomes very narrow and you have no space to move when different shifts are happening or different risks are expanding in that landscape. Whereas when taking an approach that also integrates collaborative action, also integrates this lens to, okay, I am working on my own supply chain to implement those commitments, but I'm also working with others to make sure that the wider landscape and sector races, driving that incremental progress across the sector. That's where you're also building this resilience, both for the production landscapes and in turn also for your own supply chains. So finally, just to wrap up, the work on forests is not something new. Now we have new upcoming regulation, but some companies like Jerónimo Martins have been taking action on forests for a long time. There's a lot of progress that has been made, also a lot of learnings to take from the past years of action. And it's really important in the current moment to think of what's the right mix of actions to drive progress. It can be sometimes maybe overwhelming or confusing for companies. Where should we focus? Should we focus on just regulatory compliance, on certification, which we're going to hear about in a second, or should we focus on addressing risks right here in Portugal or in the faraway supply base? And the reality is that for global leading companies, it's becoming more and more important to ensure supply chains and production are both responsible and resilient. And for this, you will need the right mix of actions and collaborative, whereas the work on your supply chain is the key foundation, it's also these collaborative actions that are going to allow us to solve the issues at the scale that is needed to drive this change towards forest positive. Thank you very much.